My brother had the Realtor's number in his phone before the memorial service ended. He had an appraisal contact. He had a timeline. He had sat at the family dinner table 2 months before our mother died and described, in a voice pitched just low enough to be private, what the spring market was doing in Raleigh, and Lyle Fenn had nodded the way that people nod when they believe they are participating in a conversation that concerns them. Conrad had done a great deal of preparation. What he had not done was read the deed to the house. Good day, dear listeners, it's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Some people confuse proximity with ownership. They are present for every holiday, every difficult phone call, every hospital visit, and they assume that presence entitles them to something. What they miss is that other people were present too, quietly, consistently, without keeping score. And sometimes the person who wasn't keeping score has a piece of paper that has been keeping it for them. The piece of paper does not know that anyone expected otherwise. It simply exists, recorded with the county, waiting for the moment when the expectation meets the record. I am B. Ashworth, née Harker, and I am 52 years old. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the house where my mother spent the last years of her life, and where I spent the last 3 years of hers with her. Before I moved in, I had spent 26 years working in title insurance, a field that most people find dry, which is their prerogative. But that gave me something most people do not have: an instinctive, practical fluency with property law, with the specific weight of recorded documents, with the difference between what someone believes they own and what the county records say they own. In title insurance, you spend your days reviewing the gap between those two things, reading chain of title, identifying encumbrances, catching the moment when an assumption about ownership bumps into what the record actually says. I had spent 26 years in that gap. I had seen families lose properties they believed they owned for generations because a deed had been recorded incorrectly 50 years earlier, and no one had checked. I had seen estates complicated by instruments that were perfectly legal, but that no one had told the beneficiaries about. I understood, in the specific technical way that comes from 26 years of professional immersion, that what matters is not what people believe and not what people intend and not what anyone has told anyone at the dinner table. What matters is what is recorded. The record is the authority. The record does not care about assumptions. I retired at 49 when my mother's health made it necessary. I moved into the house in the spring. I was not asked to. I offered. My mother said yes before I finished the sentence. Dorothea Ashworth was 81 years old when she had her first stroke. She recovered partially. Her speech returned in full, her mobility partially, her independence not at all. She needed help with her medications, with her exercises, with a walker she resisted and then accepted, and then relied on completely. She needed someone in the house in the mornings when the physical therapist came, at 6:30 when the medications had to be taken with food and a full glass of water, at the specific moment in the mid-morning when the exercises the therapist had prescribed needed to begin. 15 minutes of hand and wrist movement, 10 minutes of ankle rotation, the set of standing exercises that required B to be within arm's reach in case the balance failed. And at noon, when the second medication round was due, and in the afternoon when the nap was best taken before 3, or the night's sleep was disrupted, and in the evenings when the day's energy was spent and the particular vulnerability of the evening hours made my mother need someone present, even when she did not need anything specific done. The physical therapist had said at the first assessment that the most important factor in my mother's recovery and maintenance was consistency. I had made consistency the architecture of our days. And in the evenings when the medications needed to be organized, and at night when the particular fear that comes with age and diminished capacity made sleeping alone in a big house feel impossible. I was that person for 3 years. I was that person because it was right. And the decision to move in had been made in about 10 minutes on a Sunday evening after the hospital called. And Pip had agreed before I finished the sentence. And within the week, we had moved enough of our things to make the arrangement functional and permanent. I did not experience it as a sacrifice. I experienced it as a reorientation. There were things about the 3 years that were genuinely difficult. Not because my mother was difficult, but because sustained care is difficult in the way that sustained anything is difficult, which is to say that it requires a consistent expenditure of attention and energy that accumulates in ways you notice only in retrospect. I noticed it in retrospect. I noticed it in the first weeks after she died, when I had the house to myself and Pip to myself. And the mornings were suddenly without structure, without the medication schedule and the exercise routine and the specific sequence of small tasks that had organized every day for 3 years. The structure's absence was a kind of grief that I had not anticipated. Not grief for her absence specifically, though that was also present, but grief for the structure itself, which had been its own form of meaning. I made new structures. That is what you do. My mother's house became our house, practically if not legally, and the 3 years became the 3 years. And because my mother was my mother, and because the arithmetic of the situation was clear, and I have never been a person who avoids clear arithmetic. The care involved was extensive, not in the way that makes for dramatic stories. My mother did not require emergency intervention every week, was not in constant crisis, was not the kind of patient who produces a narrative of dramatic reversals. What she required was reliable, sustained presence. Someone who was there when the physical therapist arrived at 8 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and when the pharmacist called with a question about the medication dosage, and when the grab bar in the shower worked loose in December and needed to be resecured before she could use the bathroom safely in the morning. Someone who understood the medication schedule, which was 4 prescriptions on different timing patterns, and the exercise routine, which had specific variants for good days and bad days, and the particular food preferences that had shifted after the stroke in ways that required some experimentation before we found the repertoire she could eat comfortably. Someone who was there for the 3 nights she was frightened and could not say why, and simply needed a light on in the hallway and the knowledge that someone was in the next room. I was there for all of that. It was not a sacrifice. It was the obvious thing to do. and because there was no version of the situation where I did otherwise. I did not think about what it might mean for the estate. That is not why I was there. Conrad visited twice a month, sometimes more. He is not a negligent brother, and I want to be precise about that because precision matters in this kind of account, and imprecision is how false conclusions get made. Conrad came when he came. He was present when he was present. What he could not have seen from Charlotte on alternate weekends was the texture of the days between his visits. The specific weight of a Tuesday in February when my mother had a bad night and needed help at 4 a.m. and was frightened and embarrassed. And I helped her without making it something to be embarrassed about. Because you learn how to be present in a way that does not diminish the person you are present for. The weight of the Thursday when the insurance company disputed a home modification claim, and I spent 4 hours on the phone resolving it without telling my mother because she didn't need to know and it would have worried her. The weight of the evenings when she was tired in the particular way that is not about sleep, but about accumulation, the accumulation of being less than you were. And I sat with her, and we watched the program she liked and did not talk about what the tiredness meant. And imprecision is how false conclusions get made. He drove from Charlotte. He brought food. He sat with our mother and watched the programs she liked, and took her to the appointments that happened to fall on his visit weekends. He called every Sunday. He showed up for every birthday and holiday. He was present in the way that a person can be present, who has a full-time career and a house in another city and a life organized around other commitments. He loved our mother. He believed that what he was doing was equivalent to what I was doing. He had simply not done the arithmetic. Pip, my husband, moved into the house when I moved in. He is a contractor, patient, handy, and wholly uncomplicated about other people's financial arrangements, in the way that people are uncomplicated who have never confused money with meaning. He grew up in a family where money was discussed plainly and without drama, as a practical fact rather than a measure of anything else, and he has carried that plainness into his adult life and into our marriage. He had known when we moved into my mother's house that the arrangement might have implications for what we would eventually inherit or not inherit, and he had said when I mentioned this concern before we moved in, "B, we're moving in because your mother needs us. We can sort the rest out later." That was the entire extent of our financial conversation about the arrangement before we moved in. Later, when the deed question arose, and I explained the J.W. Ross situation to him in detail, he had listened carefully and said, "So the house was already yours?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Good. Then there's nothing to sort out." He returned to the plumbing work he had been doing in the upstairs bathroom and did not discuss the matter further until I asked him to. He installed the grab bars in the bathrooms. He built the ramp at the back steps, a gentle slope designed for my mother's walker, but slightly steeper than it should have been, a fact that Pip identified almost immediately and had plans to correct, but never finished before my mother died, and then set aside in the weight of the aftermath. He did not discuss the house's value at any point in the 3 years we lived in it. He did not ask about the estate. He made dinner on the evenings when I was too tired to cook and fixed things when they broke, and was simply present steadily without keeping score. The pale blue folder has lived in the bottom drawer of my mother's desk since the year she had the deed recorded. She wrote on the tab in her handwriting, precise school teacher's cursive, letters carefully formed, the kind of handwriting that people of that generation cultivated as a matter of character. Joint tenancy, recorded. She showed it to me once 2 years before she died, on an afternoon when we were going through her papers together. She pulled out the folder and said, "This is for you." She held it for a moment before handing it over, not with ceremony, simply with the specific weight of someone passing something they have thought about carefully. The folder was pale blue, the shade of old file folders from the 70s that have mostly disappeared from current stationery. The tab was labeled in her handwriting, joint tenancy, recorded, in the same clear cursive she had used for 40 years. Inside, the original recorded deed, the filing receipt from Wake County, Adobe's covering letter to the Register of Deeds, everything in order, everything labeled. My mother organized documents the way she organized everything, clearly in sequence, so there would be no ambiguity about what it was and what it was for. I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "No. This is specifically for you, B, not for later, now. So you know it's there." I understood what she meant. I put the folder back and did not take it out again until I needed it. Adaz Odom has been a practicing estate attorney in Raleigh for 31 years. She is 61, precise in her language, and possessed of the specific quality that excellent attorneys develop over a long career, an ability to manage difficult situations without escalating them, to give advice that is accurate without being dramatic, to be exactly as present as the situation requires and not an inch beyond. She and my mother had worked together for 20 years. Odaz has the specific quality that I associate with the best practitioners in any field, a complete absence of the kind of professional performance that substitutes impressiveness for accuracy. She does not use legal language when plain language will do. She does not create complexity where simplicity is available. She had been my mother's attorney for 2 decades because my mother was a woman who valued precision, and Adobe provided it at a price that was fair and in a manner that was reliable. When my mother told her, 2 years before her death, that she wanted to add me to the deed as joint tenant with right of survivorship, Adaz had asked several questions. She had asked whether my mother understood the effect of the instrument, that the property would transfer automatically outside of probate and could not be altered by will or by later instruction. She had asked whether my mother had discussed this with her other children, or intended to. She had asked whether my mother was making this decision voluntarily and without external pressure. My mother had answered all 3 questions clearly, had said she understood the effect, had said she did not intend to discuss it further with Conrad because, as she told Adaz, she had already decided, and further discussion would not change the decision, and she saw no benefit in having the conversation. She had told Adaz that she was not doing this because she was angry at Conrad, or because she valued him less than Bill. She was doing it because B had moved into the house without being asked, had organized 3 years of her life around Dorothea's needs without complaint, and had never once indicated any expectation of compensation or recognition. Dorothea said, "I know B. She will not ask for anything. I am making the arrangement because she will not ask. Adaz wrote this down. It was in the consultation notes. Because she had thought about it thoroughly and her mind was made up, and had said that she was absolutely making the decision voluntarily, and in fact had thought of it herself without prompting from anyone. Adaz had noted these answers, prepared the deed, and filed it with Wake County. When my mother told her 2 years before her death that she wanted to add me to the deed as joint tenant with right of survivorship, Adaz had asked several questions to confirm that the instruction was deliberate and the reasoning was clear. Then she had prepared the deed and filed it with the Wake County Register of Deeds. She had the filing receipt and the title company's confirmation in her files, where they had been sitting for 2 years, organized and dated and ready. Have you ever known something was coming before it arrived? The particular quality of anticipation when you understand the shape of a situation before anyone has named it? I had been watching Conrad's awareness of the estate sharpen for months before my mother died. He had asked me once the previous spring whether our mother had updated anything recently. He had tried to make the question sound incidental. It was not incidental. I had said, I don't know exactly what she's updated. This was true in the sense that I did not know the specific dates of every update. I did know about the deed. I said nothing about the deed. Conrad nodded. He seemed satisfied. He had not asked the right question. Lyle Fenn had made his comment at the memorial reception. Not loudly. That is important because Lyle is a careful man who understands the register of a room. He had said something to Conrad near the drinks table in a voice that was positioned just below the ambient conversation about the spring market and the Raleigh neighborhood values. I had been standing across the room near the window, and I had heard it. It was not the comment of a disinterested observer. It was the comment of a man who believed he understood what was going to happen next, and found the prospect commercially interesting. 2 weeks after the funeral, Conrad came to the house with a folder. He sat down at the dining room table, the same table where our mother had eaten dinner every night for 30 years. The same table where I had eaten dinner every night for 3 years. The same table that Pip had reseated 2 of the chair legs on the previous winter 'cause they had worked loose. Conrad sat at that table with his folder and his plan, and he said in the measured voice of a person who believes he is delivering difficult information with appropriate gentleness, I know this house has been your home, but it was Mom's asset, and we're both her heirs. You can use your share toward something of your own. He said it gently. I want to give him that. In the 10 days between his visit and his attorney's filing, Conrad and I did not speak. There was nothing to say that was not already said, what he had come to the house to tell me. I had answered with the pale blue folder. I used the 10 days to complete the estate tasks that had nothing to do with the house, the personal property inventory, the savings account notification, the car title transfer that required 2 trips to the DMV because the first paperwork had been filled out in the wrong sequence, administrative work. The kind that keeps you specific and grounded when the abstract situation is difficult. I have always preferred administrative work in difficult periods to the absence of it. A task with a correct outcome does not require you to feel anything in particular to complete it. It requires attention and accuracy. and attention and accuracy are available even when other resources are depleted. I worked through the estate tasks at my mother's desk in the evenings, with the pale blue folder in the bottom drawer beside me. Each evening, the task list shortened. The shortening was progress even when the legal situation produced nothing that looked like progress. He was trying to be considerate in the way that people are considerate when they have already decided what is going to happen and are managing the emotional dimension of informing you of it. He had contacted 2 real estate agents. He had a rough spring listing timeline. He had Lyle Fenn's market commentary from the memorial reception and presumably other data. He had a plan. I learned later from a cousin who had received the email that Conrad had sent a group message to the extended family within 10 days of our mother's death with the subject line estate planning next steps. He had not consulted an attorney before sending it. I received the email from a cousin who had forwarded it with the note, "Have you seen this?" I read it twice. The email presented the estate situation in a manner that was technically not false. It named no specific figures, made no explicit claims about the house, but whose implicit framework was entirely incorrect. It assumed a probate estate that included the property. It assumed a division of that estate into 2 equal shares. It assumed a spring sale and a subsequent distribution. Every assumption was wrong. I read it twice, and then I called Adazi Odom's office and left a message. He had not spoken to me about the estate. He had sent the email because he believed he understood the situation and wanted to manage the information efficiently, which is a Conrad characteristic that serves him well in financial advising and had, in this instance, led him to announce an outcome before verifying the facts that would determine it. The email mentioned the property. It mentioned a spring market. It did not mention me by name, but its implication about the estate's composition was clear. Have you ever been told, gently and carefully, something that was entirely incorrect? There is a particular quality to that experience, the experience of someone presenting, with full conviction, a statement that you know to be factually wrong. You feel something that is not quite the anger you would feel if the statement were aggressive. It is more like a very quiet, very clear recognition. I felt the recognition. I let Conrad finish. Then I got up from the table and went to my mother's bedroom, which is the room I have slept in since she died because there was no reason to move back across the hall. And I took the pale blue folder out of the bottom drawer of her desk, and I came back to the dining room, and I set it on the table in front of Conrad. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. That is the legal phrase for what my mother had done. Under North Carolina General Statute Section 41-2, 2 or more parties may hold real property as joint tenants with right of survivorship, JTWROS, meaning that when one joint tenant dies, the property passes immediately and automatically to the surviving tenant or tenants, not through probate, not through a will, not through the intestacy calculations of a court. The surviving tenant takes the property at the moment of the other tenant's death by operation of law. The property does not enter the estate. It cannot be divided by a will. It cannot be distributed through probate. It simply transfers, as it was always going to transfer, because that is what a JTWROS deed is for. My mother had had the deed prepared and recorded 2 years before she died. She had done it after careful conversation with Adai's Odom, after explaining her reasoning clearly and unprompted, and specifically asking that the filing be confirmed. She had put the recorded deed in a pale blue folder and written joint tenancy, recorded on the tab in her schoolteacher's cursive, and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk, where she knew I would find it if I ever needed it. Conrad looked at the deed for a long time. He read it carefully. He is a financial advisor. He knows how to read a document. And then he looked at me. Then he picked up the deed and handed it back, and he picked up his folder and his plan, and he stood up and left the room. He did not say anything. The silence told me everything I needed to know about whether he had understood what the document meant. I want to be precise about what happened in that silence. Conrad sat at the table with the deed in his hand and read it fully. The grantor and grantee names, the property description, the survivorship provision, the recording stamp from Wake County. He read the recording date. He read my mother's signature. He read the phrase joint tenants with right of survivorship. And he understood what that phrase means. He set the deed down. He looked at me for a moment, the look of someone who has run the calculation and arrived at a number they did not expect. Then he picked up the deed and handed it back to me and walked out of the dining room. I heard the front door. I heard his car. The house was quiet after Conrad drove away. The particular quality of that quiet is difficult to describe precisely. Not relief, not exactly. Something more like the settling that happens when a question that has been hanging in the air is finally resolved, not with resolution that is satisfying, but with resolution that is simply complete. The question had been answered. The answer had been placed on the table in a pale blue folder. Conrad had read it and left. The house was the house. The deed said what the deed said. I went to the kitchen and found Pip finishing the dishes, and I leaned against the doorframe for a moment before going in. The kitchen smelled of dish soap, and the lamp on the counter was on, giving the kitchen the specific warmth of a room that has been used by someone comfortable in it. Pip has always been comfortable in kitchens. He had made himself at home in my mother's kitchen in the particular way of a person who understands that making yourself at home in someone else's kitchen is an act of care for the person whose kitchen it is. Pip was in the kitchen. He had been there since Conrad arrived, had heard the conversation through the open doorway, had not come in, had stayed in the kitchen and done the dishes and waited. When I came to the kitchen doorway, he looked at me. I said, "He's gone." He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you want tea?" I said, "Yes," and sat at the kitchen table, the small one, not the dining room table, and he made tea, and we sat together in the kitchen for a long time, and neither of us said much. And that was the right amount. Conrad retained a probate attorney within the following week. I learned about the retention from a Days who called me when she received the notice of appearance. She said, "Harris Beale has filed on behalf of your brother, undue influence on the deed." I said I expected something. She said, "So did I. I'll respond to discovery within 10 days. She asked how I was. I said, "I'm fine," she said. "I know. Call me when you're not." I sat at my mother's desk after the call, looking at the pale blue folder where it had been since the confrontation. The folder was where it had been. The deed was inside it. The recording stamp was dated 2 years before my mother died. Nothing about the proceeding was going to change what the stamp said. The attorney's name was Harris Beale, and he was competent and organized in the specific way that probate attorneys who handle straightforward estates are competent and organized, thorough within the conventional parameters, less equipped for situations that depart from them. He filed a motion in the estate proceedings arguing that the JTWROS deed had been executed under undue influence, the legal theory that my mother's decision had been compromised by my proximity and my ongoing role in her care, and that the deed, therefore, should not be given full legal effect. The undue influence theory requires demonstrating that the person making the legal instrument lacked the independent judgment to make it freely. In practice, establishing undue influence requires specific evidence of a relationship of dependency or trust that was exploited, evidence of the testator's weakened condition, evidence of the beneficiary's active participation in procuring the instrument, and, critically, evidence that the instrument itself reflects the beneficiary's will rather than the testator's. The standard is not met simply by the existence of a close relationship or by the fact that one party provided care. If it were, every parent who put a caregiving child on a deed would be presumed to have acted under that child's influence. The law does not operate that way, because the law recognizes that people can make clear decisions in favor of people they love without those decisions being invalidated by the love. ADESA's document production made every element of the undue influence analysis impossible to sustain. There was a specific moment, described to me by my attorney afterward, when Harris Beale reviewed the engagement letter date 14 months before the deed was executed, and understood that the chronology had foreclosed the argument he had been building. You cannot establish that a deed was procured under the influence of a caregiving relationship when the engagement for that deed predates the caregiving relationship by a year and a half. The caregiving began 3 years before my mother died. The engagement letter was 14 months before the deed's execution, and roughly 30 months before my mother's death. My mother had thought of the deed, sought a Daisy's advice, and initiated the process before I had moved into the house. The sequence was irrefutable. Harris Beale reviewed the engagement letter, conferred with his client, and filed the withdrawal within the week. The engagement letter predated any discussion of care arrangements. The consultation notes documented 3 separate meetings at which my mother's reasoning was recorded in detail. The handwritten instruction was unambiguous. Harris Beale had requested the documents in hopes of finding a gap in the record. There was no gap. My mother was a woman who had worked with a dies odium for 20 years. She understood what documentation was for. It requires showing that the person making the instrument was so influenced by another party's presence or pressure that the instrument does not represent their genuine intent. It was, in the context of Dorothea Ashworth, an argument that required ignoring 20 years of documented attorney-client communications with a practitioner she had retained independently. 3 separate consultations about the deed, handwritten instructions, and the filing confirmation that Adaize Odum maintained in her files. Adaize responded to Harris Beale's discovery request with a full document production, the signed engagement letter from my mother, dated 14 months before the deed was executed, Notes from 3 separate consultations, each documenting my mother's stated reasoning. My mother's handwritten instruction to proceed in her school teacher's cursive, clear, and specific, and the recording confirmation from Wake County. She also provided a written statement. The statement ran 4 paragraphs. It began with a factual account of how and when Dorothea Ashworth had first engaged her services for estate planning purposes, the specific dates of their 3 consultations about the JTWROS deed, and the specific date of execution and filing. The second paragraph described Dorothea's demeanor and apparent mental state at each consultation, using language that was professional and specific, drawn from notes taken at the time. The third paragraph addressed the undue influence question directly. In 20 years of estate practice, Adaz had encountered clients whose judgment was compromised by age, illness, or the proximity of an interested party, and Dorothea Ashworth was not among them. She had been clear, specific, and unprompted at every meeting. She had referred to the deed as something she had decided on herself and had come to have documented. The fourth paragraph was 1 sentence. I have never seen a client more certain of what she wanted or more prepared to explain why. I will quote the relevant portion because it is important. Dorothea Ashworth discussed the deed with me during multiple meetings, explained her reasoning clearly and without prompting, and specifically asked that the filing be confirmed after recording. At no time did I observe any indication that her judgment was impaired or that her decision was influenced by any external party. The decision was hers, freely and clearly made. The undue influence argument was withdrawn 24 days after it was filed. Have you ever watched a position collapse? Not dramatically, not with shouting or recrimination or a scene that could be narrated with particular force, but simply and quietly, because the facts did not support it, and everyone involved had understood from the beginning that the facts did not support it, and the withdrawal was simply the formal acknowledgement of what had always been true. That is how it went. Harris Beale notified my attorney of the withdrawal in a 1-page letter that was courteous and brief. I filed the letter in the folder with the deed and the recording confirmation and closed the drawer. Conrad called from Charlotte 3 weeks after the withdrawal. He said he was not angry. He said he understood that their mother had made her choices. He said these things in the measured tone of someone who is working to accept an outcome and has not entirely succeeded, but intends to succeed eventually. And I respected him for the effort. He asked if I would consider selling him a share at current market value, not the whole house, just a portion. A buyout option. He named a figure. I said I would think about it. I said it because I had not decided yet, and I do not make statements I have not decided on. I thought about it for 6 weeks, which was the full time I gave myself. Then I did not call him back because the thinking had produced an answer, and the answer was no. 6 weeks after that, Conrad sent a brief email acknowledging that the matter was settled. 3 sentences. The matter was resolved. He wished me well. He hoped for a positive relationship going forward. The email of someone who has determined to be decent about an outcome they did not want, which takes a specific kind of effort. And I credited him for the effort. I waited 2 days and wrote back 3 sentences of my own, that I appreciated the message, that I wished him well too, and that I hoped we could arrive in time at something like the relationship that had existed before the month after our mother's funeral. Whether we get there is an open question. I have decided to leave it open. He did not apologize. He did not need to. I had not required it. What I had required was that the deed be read and the record be acknowledged, and both of those things had happened. The legal resolution took 4 months from the date of Conrad's first visit to the date of his email. In those 4 months, the house was never in legal question, because the JTW ROS transfer had already occurred at the moment of my mother's death. The proceeding was a proceeding about whether the transfer would be contested, not about whether it had occurred, and it had occurred. The house remained the house. The dining room table remained the dining room table. The pale blue folder remained in the bottom drawer of my mother's desk, because I had returned it there after the confrontation with Conrad, because that is where it lived, and there was no reason to move it. I opened the drawer occasionally to confirm it was still there, which I recognized as a slightly irrational behavior, but engaged in anyway, because the folder in the drawer was the specific form in which the resolution existed, and I found it clarifying to know it was where it had always been. The 4 months had their own texture. In the first month, there was the motion and the document production and the waiting that is specific to legal proceedings, the waiting that is not passive because there are tasks attached to it, but that is not active either, because the tasks have been done and the next step belongs to someone else. I administered the parts of my mother's estate that did fall within probate, her personal property, her savings account, her car, in parallel with the JTW ROS question, because those things were genuinely part of the estate and needed to be processed regardless of what happened with the house. The personal property was divided between Conrad and me without difficulty. We had always agreed more clearly about our mother's things than about her money, and the process of dividing the furniture and the books and the small objects of a life was, in its own way, a different kind of grief than the legal proceeding, quieter, more specific, more real. The books I kept, the dining room table I kept, the lamp that had been in the living room for 30 years I kept, because it was the lamp that had been on when I drove home at midnight after the hospital shifts during the worst week, and its light in the window had been the specific light of home for 3 years, and home was not something I was prepared to distribute. In those 4 months, the house continued to be exactly what it had been, the house where my mother had lived, where I had spent 3 years caring for her, where the grab bars were still in the bathrooms and the ramp was still at the back steps, and the dining room floor still bore the scuffs of 30 years of chairs being pushed back from the table. None of those things changed because of the legal proceeding. The house did not know there was a legal proceeding. It simply continued to exist, as houses do. After the matter was settled, I had the deed reissued in my name as sole owner. This is a routine administrative step when a JTW ROS property transfers, a clerical update rather than a legal change, because the property had already transferred by operation of law. The title company confirmed the update in a letter that took approximately 2 pages to convey approximately 4 sentences of substantive information. I read the letter and filed it. Pip replaced the back ramp with a proper low-grade deck. He built it in April over a long weekend. He took down the original ramp, which he had always considered a temporary fix, and built the deck frame over 2 days and the decking surface over a third. Cedar, for the humidity, a semi-transparent, warm gray stain. The result is that the back of the house now looks intentional. The deck connects the kitchen door to the yard with the easy grade of something built with care. My mother would have used it. She would have said something dry about the color and then sat on it in the afternoon with a book. She was not a woman who withheld appreciation for things done well. She simply preferred to express it through use, through returning to a place that pleased her. He had been planning to redo it for 2 years, had identified the slope problem almost immediately after he built the original, had planned the correction, had set it aside when my mother died. The deck took him a long weekend. He built it out of cedar, which he said would hold better in the weather, and he stained it a color that was slightly warmer than the original, and that he and I discussed for approximately 30 minutes before settling on. The deck is the right slope now. It is also more attractive than the ramp was, which was not the priority, but which is a fact worth noting, because things built with care have a way of also being things that look right, and the deck looks right, and the house looks like a house where someone has been paying attention for a long time, which it is, which it has been, which was not the priority, but is a fact. He also resanded the dining room floor. This was a project he had been putting off for a long time. The floor had been scuffed since before we moved in. Scuffed in the way that floors get scuffed over decades of furniture being moved and dinners being served and the accumulated wear of a house where people actually lived. He rented the equipment on a Saturday and worked through the afternoon, and by evening, the floor had the warm, clear quality of properly finished wood. I stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the floor for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen and made dinner. We ate at the kitchen table that night, not the dining room one. The dining room table was still the dining room table. The floor was new. Adaz Odom came for dinner in the spring. She arrived at 7 with a bottle of wine and a small bunch of flowers that she said she had bought at the farmer's market on the way over, which I believed because Adaz is the kind of person who stops at the farmer's market rather than the grocery store when she has time to stop at the farmer's market. She sat in the kitchen while I finished the meal, and she and Pip talked about the deck he had just built. He described the slope correction and the cedar choice and the stain color, and she asked intelligent questions about the process that reflected genuine interest rather than conversational politeness. Adaz has always struck me as someone who finds most things genuinely interesting, which is a quality I admire without fully possessing myself. We ate at the dining room table. The floor glowed in the overhead light. She did not mention the legal proceedings during the meal. After dinner, over the wine, she told me what my mother had said. She sat at the dining room table and ate the meal I had made, and after dinner she told me what my mother had said at the last consultation. She said, "Your mother talked about you at every single meeting. She wanted to make sure. She said you'd never ask." She paused and looked at the table with the newly finished floor beneath it, and said, "She was right about that, wasn't she?" It was not quite a question. I said, "Yes. My mother was right about that." I would not have asked. I had not moved in to ask for anything. I had moved in because it was right, and the house had been the house where I lived for 3 years because that was what my mother needed, and the deed had been in the pale blue folder because my mother had been a precise woman who understood the difference between a child who shows up and a child who calls on Sundays, and who was not, in the end, interested in leaving that distinction to the probate process to sort out. She had called a dies odom. She had explained her reasoning clearly and unprompted. She had done it in the particular way that she did everything, without announcement, without drama, with the specific competence of a woman who had managed a household and raised 2 children and navigated 60 years of adult life with the tools she had, which were considerable. She had understood property law better than Conrad did, because she had a daughter who had spent 26 years in title insurance, and she had paid attention. She had understood that a will can be contested, and a JTWOS deed cannot be. She had understood that what she put in the record would outlast any conversation she might have had about her wishes. She had understood that B would not ask. She had made the arrangement. She had put it in the pale blue folder. She had said, "This is specifically for you, so you know it's there." Then she had put the folder back in the drawer and not mentioned it again, because the filing was the point, and filed things do not require supplementary narration. She had asked that the filing be confirmed. She had written joint tenancy, recorded on the tab of the pale blue folder in her schoolteacher's cursive, and put it in the bottom drawer of her desk where she knew I would find it when I needed it. After the estate closed, I found in my mother's nightstand drawer a handwritten note addressed to Conrad. It was beneath the other things in the drawer: a rosary, a small calendar she had used to track her medications in the last months, a photograph from a holiday I could place by my own approximate age at 18 or 19, smiling in someone's garden. The note was folded once and sealed with a small piece of tape. Her handwriting on the front, Conrad. Just the one name in her careful cursive with the particular economy that characterized everything she wrote. It had clearly been prepared well in advance and placed there for the situation she had anticipated would arise. I did not know exactly what it said. I could infer its general character from knowing my mother. She would have been direct and specific, and would not have been unkind. She would have explained her reasoning. She would have said something about love and something about what she meant by what she had done. She was a school teacher for 38 years. She knew how to say a thing clearly in the fewest possible words. It was in her handwriting, the same handwriting as the folder tab, the same handwriting as 40 years of correspondence. I did not open it. I mailed it to his address in Charlotte with a blank return address, because the note was his and not mine, and because whatever my mother had wanted to say to him, she had wanted to say privately, and I was not the intended reader. I do not know if he opened it. I have not asked. I have decided that I do not need to know. Dear listeners, if your mother or your father or your aunt ever sat with an attorney and made an arrangement that no one ever mentioned at the family dinner table, tell me in the comments. Tell me whether you found out the way I found out, across a dining room table from someone who had made extensive plans. Tell me where you are listening from. Raleigh is beautiful in the spring, and the deck Pip built is the right slope now. And the floor is the color of warm cedar, and the pale blue folder is in the bottom drawer of my mother's desk, where it has always been. You know what this story is. It is about the difference between being present in the way that is visible and being present in the way that is necessary. My mother knew the difference. She had known it for 3 years, from the inside of a house where one of her children had moved in and organized their life around what she needed. She did not announce what she knew. She called Adaizu Odum. She explained her reasoning. She signed the deed. She wrote joint tenancy, recorded on the tab of a pale blue folder in her schoolteacher's cursive, and put it in the bottom drawer of her desk where she knew I would find it. She kept the score that I refused to keep. She kept it in the county records, where it is still kept now and where it will remain for as long as county records are maintained, which is to say for a very long time. Thank you for being here. Lena has more of these. Stay with us.